Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of Hammer Time. And please let me begin with an apology. I know we had a little bit of a hiatus over the last 2 weeks, but trust me, we are working tirelessly in the background to both increase the quality of the show, to have more guests, to have more content, and I hope that it will only get better as we move forward. Many thanks to all of those who have been patient, waiting for the newest episode, and I'm very hopeful and optimistic that we can return to our regular weekly schedule. But that being said, I would like to point to an event that took place in New York and that kind of got quite some media attention, particularly the very intriguing pictures of Georgia Meloni and Elon Musk. But Ms. Meloni also held a speech that I believe shows us that Hammer Time has been slightly ahead of its time. Let's take a quick look.
As West, I think we have two risks to counter. The first is what one of the greatest contemporary European philosopher, Roger Scruton, called oikophobia, from the Greek words oikos, which means home, and phobia, which means fear. Kyriakos, this is my personal tribute to your word tonight, okay? Sorry for being so serious, but I want to share with you this thought I have. Oikophobia is the aversion to one's home, a mounting contempt, which leads us to want to violently erase the symbols of our civilizations in the US as in Europe. The second risk is the paradox that while on the one hand, the West looks down on itself, on the other hand, often claims to be superior to the others.
Now, while I will not go so far to claim that Ms. Meloni is an avid viewer of Hammer Time, I would like to remind all my viewers and listeners that one of the very first episodes dealt precisely with the issue of oikophobia. It was also the episode where I had a long conversation with Benedict Beckelt, who wrote a fantastic book on this topic as well. So what this tells you is that the ideas that we have expressed on this show over the last couple of weeks are very much on the mind, at least of the center-right politicians. And although there is probably plenty of issues one can criticize Georgia Meloni for, I think she does get the main point. I think she does get what ails not just Europe and the United States, but the West more generally. This hate towards one's home, where one comes from, this constant guilt complex, this idea that Europe and the West have to atone for their past, for all the supposed sins that we have committed. And what this can lead to, of course, is very well reflected in a new report by the European Commission, the European Council on Foreign Affairs. And this report claims, this is a headline from Brussels Signal, and I, as always, highly recommend that you also sign up and put a bookmark onto the homepage of Brussels Signal. And this report says that whiteness and Europeanness, a danger to the European Union, a European Council on Foreign Relations report claims. Overall, the ECFR warned that there was a public drift towards understanding Europeanness in ethnic terms, rather than in a civic way it viewed as more constructive. What this basically means is that Europeans who identify as European because of their history, because of their nationality, because of their language, because of their culture, that this is dangerous, right? That apparently their idea of a European identity would be based on the European bureaucracy, right? Something that they have tried in the past in the United Kingdom, where they were claiming that the source of British identity should be the National Health Service. Now, most people know that this is not how it works, right? Most people know that in order to feel a connection to something, to be tied to something, it must be part of the longer cultural, historical tradition. Right? You cannot just identify with something that was willed into existence politically yesterday, right? These things need more time. They need to develop. And as we also said in previous episodes, there is something like a European identity. So this idea that the European Union has a monopoly on defining what a European identity is supposed to look like is ridiculous. The consciousness that there is something specifically European in a way that there is not something specifically Asian, for example, right, has been around for a long time. It grew out of ethnic differences, yet religious commonalities, right? Europe was always divided into different nations, but it was also unified by a shared commitment to Christendom, despite, of course, then the division into Protestantism and Catholicism and all these things. But there was always a sense that Europe as a shared idea does exist. And that goes back much further than just the 1950s, the 1960s, and the beginning of the European unification process. And the will or the desire to ignore the importance of history, the importance of tradition, in this emergence of a European identity comes with significant dangers. I want to show you real quick as headline, a title page from National Geographic about the new Europeans. Now, this is from 2018, if I recall correctly. And if you take a look at this picture, it's all Arabs, right? These are all people, obviously, with an Arab Muslim background. And the headline says, "The New Europeans, How Waves of Immigrants Are Reshaping a Continent." And most people know, of course, what that reshaping is supposed to look like, right? Because these people are, and this is no attack on the people themselves, but they are not European culturally from their identity in any meaningful sense of the word. They are, which is fine, right? They are Arab, they are Muslim, right? They come from a different cultural background. And there is nothing wrong with this. But the problem, of course, starts is if those two things start to meet. So the idea that if you import millions of people from a completely different cultural background and say, oh, look at that, these are the new Europeans. In what sense are they European? And the problem here is that Europe has unlearned. We no longer know, or at least our elites no longer know, how to define what it means to be European. So in their view, everybody who sets foot onto the European continent by some magic that nobody can describe turns into being a European, or in this case, a new European. And of course, a lot of the revolts that we're seeing in East Germany, in elections in France, in elections in the UK, is a revolt against that. Because even though sometimes it's hard for the people to identify and define what it means to be European, what it means to be British, what it means to be German, they do understand very well what does not mean to be European, what does not mean to be German, right? For example, as we've talked about in many occasions on this show, that clan violence, as it happens in Malmö, as it happens increasingly in Germany, as it happens in the city of Grenoble, right? That is not European. That the epidemic of knife attacks, of stabbings, this is not something that was common in Europe just a couple of decades ago. We know that the epidemic of rape that is going on, for example, gang rape in Germany, a couple of years ago, this was something that was reported when it happened outside of Europe because it was justifiably so, a shocking incident to happen. Now, in Germany, based on statistics we have from 2023, it happens every other day. So these are things that clearly would be defined as being non-European. And this is, once again, the issue that we're struggling with is it's easier to define what's not European than to define what is European. But let's take a closer look at why this is happening. I want to show another graph from the United States that identifies the party affiliation in academia. Now, I want to be very clear here. What you can see on this graph are mostly the social sciences and the humanities. So luckily enough, some of the more natural sciences, there the situation is not that bad. But what you can see there is that within communications, anthropology, history, English, right, all these fields, they are dominated in the United States by members of the Democratic Party or by Democrat-leaning individuals, meaning that, of course, their expertise is also influenced by their political leanings. And this explains to us so many of the mistaken assumptions that were made over the last 30 years. I'm sure that many remember, right, Jeb Bush saying that illegal immigration is a potentially a positive thing. We remember what happened in Europe, right, in 2015, when the argument was, well, this mass migration will cause a new renaissance, a rejuvenation of Europe, and it will not come with any problems. The reason why so many experts claimed that this is going to happen is because these experts had their own political leanings. They were marinated, they were socialized in a left-wing environment, so they believed all the things that the political left has always believed, right? The idea that the nation state is something reactionary, that national identity has to be overcome, that our customs and traditions are something that is meant to be ignored, that holds us back, that is only something for old-fashioned individuals, but nothing for the progressive mind. But of course, what we in fact see happening is that the first line of defense in every country, in every society, is not the law, right? It is the customs, it is the traditions of a people, right? They define how somebody behaves. They define what virtuous behavior is. And the idea that you can then replace customs, traditions, with like a multicultural hodgepodge where nobody really knows what the rules are, where nobody knows what's really supposed to happen, how we are supposed to interact with each other. Right? It's very clear what this most likely will lead to an ever stronger and more intrusive state. Because if people can no longer arrange their interactions on their own, based on customs, based on traditions, you need an ever more intrusive state that's going to organize intersocietal relations for you. And this is, of course, where the journey is going, right? This is what we see in the United States. This is what we see in Europe, that the state becomes ever more powerful in order to, because I think they will fail, in order to replace the connections, the social cohesion, the cultural and social capital that existed in the past. In doing so, let me show you another headline, again from Brussels Signal, about that the European Union gives 9 million euros to organizations that help migrants to evade deportation, right? To NGOs, to organizations that help them to avoid being deported, even though they might have committed criminal acts, even though they might have overstayed their visas, even though their asylum claims have been rejected. And this also goes back to what Ms. Meloni was saying at the beginning, that there is an issue if a society, if a country loses faith in itself, if they no longer think that their society, their traditions are worthwhile to be continued, right, then it makes no difference to them who is here, right? As we saw on the picture before, then the new Europeans are only defined by the geographical area in which they are. So somebody who happens to be in the area that is called on a map Europe, well, then that's a European, and there's nothing more to it. We see the same conversations when we talk about passports. There's this idea within the elites and on the political left that your citizenship is just a piece of paper. So if you get a passport that says Austrian, if you get a passport that says German, if you get a passport that says American, then you are German, then you're Austrian, then you're American. But citizenship is more than this. Citizenship is supposed to be a commitment to this society, a commitment to the nation. And it's, if you want, in many ways, particularly for migrants, the final stage, right? As they have assimilated in a new society, they get the passport as, let's say, the crowning achievement, right? This was the recipe when migration in the United States was still functioning, right? How the Americans perceived and how they designed their migration policy. You come to the United States, you work hard, you contribute to society, and then at some point, you earn the honor, the privilege to apply for citizenship, and you get citizenship. Nowadays, the idea is just, ideally, as some on the left would like it, you cross the border, here you have a passport, here it goes, and you just hand out citizenship because it's just a piece of paper. It makes no difference. It's a reduction of people. And in many cases, and we talk about this in a second, it's a reduction of people to their contribution to the labor market in many ways, which is absurd that the same people who claim that they are Marxists, right, who claim that they are so worried about exploitation, their migration policies are precisely what Marx was accusing the capitalists of, right? You bring in cheap labor, you bring in people more and more and more that put downward pressure, particularly on low-skilled jobs, and make it harder and harder for Americans, for Europeans and others to find jobs because they're being undercut in their wages in the labor markets, which is precisely in many ways what Marx was predicting, but he was just predicting it as a class war. He did not have any eye on the migration problem that comes with it. So it's virtue signaling in many ways that comes with a huge cost for those who are already socioeconomically worse off than others. And this is something that should disturb us. And we see this, of course, in other areas as well. So I want to really kind of paint a little bit of a broader picture of what's going on here and who's behind this. There is an interesting graph, a poll that was done among regular people and Ivy League educated people, and what the attitudes of those people are. And I have to ask, quite frankly, whether or not they actually hate you. Now, if we look at this graph, the question that was posed was, to fight climate change, would you favor or oppose the strict rationing of gas, meat, and electricity? So among voters, right? 63% are against it and around 28% are for it. Against the elite 1%, we have 77% who are for it. So 77% of the 1% would like to ration gas, meat, and electricity. And among, I kid you not, among the Ivy League educated elite, it is almost 90%. So the so-called, that this brings it back to the experts, to all these people that graduated from the most expensive and finest colleges, the finest universities, right, that live in the city centers, in the urban areas, from Manhattan to Munich to Vienna to Berlin, right, which ironically, right, are those areas where their carbon footprint is the highest imaginable, because living in an urban area has a significantly higher carbon footprint than living in a rural area. They are the ones who would have no problem telling you, Joe Schmo, in Elm Street 24, that you no longer can eat meat, right? That you no longer can drive a car, that you can only have electricity on certain days and times of the week. And the reason why they can do this, another topic we talked about on this show, right? The phenomenon of moral licensing, because I'm sure that they themselves would be exempt from all these rules. Because since they so courageously fight for others not to have gas, not to have electricity, not to have meat, they deserve to have it. Right? And this is precisely the problem that we have, that the elite class, from which also the so-called experts are recruited, they have a very strong political and ideological agenda. So we should take their claims with a grain of salt. Now, this does not mean that we have to throw out all expertise. This does not mean that everything these people say is wrong. But what it does mean is we have to take a very close look on whether or not their claims are data-driven or whether they are ideology-driven. I talked about this a couple of weeks ago on a show, right, where there was a very large study looking at the degrowth agenda, on the degrowth literature, and there's quite a bit out of that. And what you can see is that almost none of this is empirical, almost none of this is data-driven. It's almost all anecdotes, attitudes, opinions, but none of it is actually grounded in science, as the saying goes, or at least in an attempt to do science in many ways. What it tries to do is to create a justification to limit the well-being of a significant number of people and enable a justification for the very well-being of a very small cadre, a very small elite. And this has direct consequences. Let's take another look. Here's a graph that shows the gender balance of migration or of asylum applicants from Afghanistan to Europe. And what you can see here, based on the age cohort as well, is there's a significant overhang on male individuals. So a lot of the migration that we have seen in the last couple of years, since 2015, has been young male immigration. And it is, by the way, no surprise that a society that becomes more male and that many of these males don't have anything productive to do, this is not a recipe for social stability. So these migration movements that we were told in 2015 would save our welfare system, would save our pensions, would lead to a rejuvenation of the labor market, would prolong the viability of our economic system. None of this actually happened, right? A lot of this was either migration into the welfare state, or of course in many ways, it was also migration into organized crime. But all the promises that have been made, and we talked about this on plenty of occasions on this show, like none of them found fulfillment. And I would argue it's similarly in the United States. And the reason why this is taking place is because the arguments are made from an ideological point of view and not from a data-driven point of view. Like we always talk about, and I do it too, so I want to clarify this a little bit. We always talk about migration in these general terms. But of course, we have to look at the details of migration. Think about it this way. You go to a doctor, right? And the doctor wants to make an assessment in your first conversation about your health condition. I would imagine that one of the first things he might ask you is about your dietary habits. What do you eat? And if your answer is, I eat food, well, then the doctor won't be able to give you a good assessment of what's going on. He would be curious, well, what kind of food to eat? Like, what's the ratio of protein? What's the ratio of carbohydrates? What's the ratio of fat? And once he knows this, right, he can make an assessment to what degree your diet is beneficial to your health and to what degree it is negative for your health. And migration is a similar thing. The idea that migration, the blanket term, is either good or bad is like saying that food, regardless of what that food actually is good or bad for you. The details matter. So when we look again at migration, if you have highly skilled labor, highly skilled individuals that come to your country, right? Maybe with a similar cultural background, they can make a wonderful contribution. They will assimilate, they will integrate, and probably a generation or two down the road, they will be indistinguishable from the original native population. But you can also have people coming to your country with vastly different cultural backgrounds, who are not skilled in any way, shape, or form to contribute to the economy or to the labor market, and that are inherently hostile towards the culture of the new country, towards the culture that they moved into. And then even 2, 3, 4 generations down the road, there will no integration, there will no assimilation, and also there will be no economic benefits. Let's take a look at Germany in particular. Let's take a look at PISA scores. The PISA is this assessment of high schoolers. And what you can see in this graph, right, it compares the PISA math scores by immigration status. So the native population, first-generation immigrants, and second-generation immigrants. In the case, just to pick out 2 examples, of Australia and Canada, first-generation and second-generation immigrants are actually outperforming, in many cases, the native population. So this is the situation you want to ideally find yourself in your migration policy, that the people that come to your country are in some areas more qualified than the people already here, right? This is a positive form of migration. This is if we stick with the diet comparison, this is the kind of diet you would like to have, right? That actually your body politic, your nation gets healthier, gets better through migration. But if you look at countries like Austria, if you look at countries like Germany, the opposite is happening, right? In the German case, for example, the people who come to Germany are less equipped, are less skilled, score lower on the PISA math scores than the native population. So what this means is that overall, the quality for people entering the labor market or trying to enter the labor market is decreasing. And this is then a diet that is having a negative effect on your body, that is having a negative effect on your physical condition. Then let's take another look if we compare, because some people would argue, it's just we don't spend enough on education, or we don't spend enough money on schools. But take a look at this graph. That is, by the way, from my good friend, Dr. Paul Vanitas. You can find him on Twitter. He produces all these wonderful graphs. So I will also put a link into the description of this video. He really does fantastic work, so I highly recommend you follow him. So what you here see is a comparison of the PISA mathematics skills and public expenses for education. And what you can see is that public spending for education is steeply increasing, and the math skills in Germany are steeply decreasing. Now, as you can imagine, a country of engineers that Germany once was needs people who do well in math, right? The people who do well in analytical thinking. So something is going on here. And if you look at that graph exactly and take a closer look, you see that it starts a little bit earlier, but the real breaking point is 2015. So again, not a coincidence that with the increase in mass migration, you also see a decrease in scholarly attainment. Now, one can say, okay, this is just the price you have to pay for a multicultural society. Some might argue, well, this is the cost of being, as the Germans would like to be, a humanitarian superpower. Fair enough. But I think then one has to be honest to the people and tell them that, well, this comes at very high costs, and not continue the lie that this will actually benefit, because it obviously is not. Now, you might sometimes wonder, why is it that I have such a strong focus on Germany? And I think the next graph is explaining this a little bit better. What you can see here is the economic power, if you want, of Germany compared to others. And if you look at the number of countries that would be necessary to have the same GDP as Germany, it shows you that the Germans, based on the social, cultural, and economic capital they have accumulated over previous generations, they are still the most significant economic power in Europe. So if they descend into irreversible decline, this will have an effect on others as well. So this is going to be a problem for other countries as well. So what's happening in Germany also matters for other countries. And the Germans, as I will talk about in a forthcoming episode, are important for another reason as well. Because in many ways, I would argue that the Germans probably are perceived, justifiably so, as having lost 2 world wars on the battlefield. But I think that ideologically, kind of the idea of self-doubt, the pessimism, the problem with modernity, the tendency towards self-hate that the Germans, I think, have more than many other nations. It has infected not just the Germans, but other Europeans and Americans as well. And it goes back to what Ms. Meloni was saying. Oikophobia, even though, as Benedict Beckel would argue, is a phenomenon that historically we have seen more often. But I think the main driver behind it these days have been the Germans, has been German political culture. This idea that Western politics should be defined by our desire to atone for our sins, real sins and imagined ones. So this is one of the reasons why the German experience will always play a significant role in this podcast. And you can see it, right? We're not just at war kind of with our past. We're also at war in many ways with conceptualizations of beauty, with concepts of health. And I used in the realm of migration the comparison to your dietary habits. But let's put it into a more literal sense and look at the following picture. Now there you see, what everyone thinks about the beauty ideal of 1992, but I think this is an interesting comparison, right? When you see kind of how we perceive beauty in 1992 and how it is perceived in 2022. And you might say, justifiably, so you might say, well, this is just fashion, right? This is, who cares about Kate Moss and Mark Wahlberg? I mean, this was just as bad an ideal of beauty as the picture on the right. Okay, I think that's a fair argument. But let's take a look at another picture from the Cosmopolitan. Where you see an obviously overweight and obese young woman, and the headline below says that this is healthy. No, it's not, right? And every doctor will tell you that it's not. Morbid obesity is under no circumstances a healthy habit, whatever the reasons are, right, that you find yourself in such a condition. It is obviously not healthy. This is precisely, in a comparative way, this is precisely the same phenomenon we see with migration, right? There is the argument that mass migration is good, and you see the evidence with your own eyes. From crime rates to other areas, you see that obviously it is not good, right? It obviously has many negative consequences. But you're being told that no, like don't trust your own eyes, like don't trust your lying eyes. It is a good thing. Like what's happening there is very positive, even though it obviously is not. So I think that's a crucial comparison. And what we of course see as a consequence as well is that people start to realize, we saw it now in the votes and the elections in Eastern Germany, right? Where particularly young people are flocking to the AfD. They realize that they have been lied to over the last couple of decades. So they look for new, not just sources of information, but they also look towards new political parties that they can join, new political movements. In a very, by the way, democratic way. I just want to point out that in Germany, in recent regional elections, participation in those elections was higher than in previous elections. So that's a very strong sign of life for democracy. So people want to participate in democracy. But you see now part of the elites, you see in part of the ruling class, that they're actually afraid of people participating more in democracy because they might vote. They might decide in ways that they don't like. So I want to show a quick video clip of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, it reminds me slowly but surely, I don't know how many have seen those 1980s, 1990s horror movies, Mike Myers, Friday the 13th, Jason's, I think 27, Jason in Space and whatnot, where towards the end of the movie, you think the monster is dead, but there's one scene where a grave or a hand sticks out of a grave or the body reappears from the lake or something, signaling to the viewer that, oh no, it's not over, there will be another installment, won't there be? And some politicians, and Hillary Clinton, Mario Draghi, Michel Barnier, they remind me of the monsters in those movies, not for their looks, please, but for the fact that every time you see that they're gone, they reappear. And here's something that Ms. Clinton had to say just recently.
Just as Mueller indicted a lot of Russians who were engaged in direct election interference and boosting Trump back in 2016. But I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda. And whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence.
You see what's happening, right? So if you don't vote, if you don't decide as those on top want you to, then maybe it's because you have fallen victim to Russian propaganda. I mean, what is not Russian propaganda these days? But you're just too stupid to process information yourself. But if you come to a conclusion and you want to share that with others, maybe we should prosecute you. Maybe we should arrest you. So this is where the journey is going. And I said this in our last episode, right? I'm more afraid of the self-declared defenders of democracy then I'm by those who supposedly are an attack on democracy. Because for as far as I can tell, all of them want to operate within the democratic system. And it is part and parcel of a democratic system that people can choose who lead them, that people can choose who is supposed to be in power and who's supposed to be in charge. And those who want to prevent a change of who's in charge are the true enemies to democracy. Before I end today's show, as always, I have a very special guest today, Connor Tomlinson from the Lotus Eaters, and he has his own show, Tomlinson Talks. He's a fantastic guest. He was recently on Trigonometry, great British political analyst. I think you will enjoy very much the conversation that we are having. As always, please check out the full conversation that will be aired next week on Brussels Signal. You're missing out. If you enjoyed this channel, please also check out the channel of Brussels Signal. Check out their homepage. I think they do the best news reporting from a center-right conservative perspective on European politics, but also on global politics. Of course, I have my own column there, so I think that's something you also will enjoy very much. So please go over there, check it out, subscribe. Like most publications, like this publication, Brussels Signal, we run by views, we run by clicks. So every second, every minute that you decide to spend with us, we're not only grateful, but you also help us to continue what we are doing. Thank you very much for joining me today, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you again next week. Hello and welcome to the 9th episode of the podcast. I'm very happy that today I can greet Connor Tomlinson. Now, there's a lot to say about Connor. I think he's one of the most interesting up-and-coming writers and commentators in the United Kingdom. You can find his own show, Tomlinson Talks, on the Lotus Eaters podcast. He writes for the European Conservative. I think, Connor, correct me if I'm wrong, I think I've also seen your writing in The Critic, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that and also the Restoration Substack as of very recently.
Yes, so you're spreading in many ways. So obviously your audience is growing, justifiably so. So Connor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ralph. I appreciate it. It's a shame that we're not in person. We're parted by a continent, but I look forward to the next time that we can make fun of one another face to face.
Oh, yes, most certainly. I can't wait either. The reason why I wanted to have you on is a very simple one. I very much enjoy your commentary on what's going on culturally and socially in the United Kingdom and Britain. I think you identify as a conservative, but only if you want to share this. I think you ran into somewhat of a kerfuffle, let's call it that, with the Conservative Party. Would you like to share it with our audience, or is it too private?
No, I've actually written a European Conservative article on it, and they asked me to keep it private, but then I just went and shared the emails to Twitter. So short version of this, I was in the Conservative Party because the Conservative Party were the ruling party. I went every year to their annual conference to go and cause trouble and report on it for my audience. First year I went to report on it, I nearly got arrested for a completely ridiculous reason. It was to do with the UK's insane speech codes, and some police officer thought I'd offended an LGBT person. Never happened, and he didn't back off anyway. All the footage is there. It's very funny. The other year, I then went and had a chat with Nigel Farage as he turned up and really upset everybody. So that was good fun. This year, I was going to go, and it's starting on... but I received an email in July as I sat listening to former Home Secretary Suella Braverman's speech at NatCon in Washington, D.C. And it had informed me that I'd been suspended from the party pending an investigation with no specified reasons. And then a few weeks later, they finally got round to doing this incredible archaeological effort and uncovered 5 tweets, which was quite impressive. And 2 of them were saying that they were wrong to expel now Reform MP, but former Conservative Party chairman, I might have had the whip, actually, Lee Anderson, for saying that Sadiq Khan is running London to the accordance of Islamists because, we have massive pro-Palestine protests every weekend and Wednesday at that time. And Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London, has made a career history of defending Islamic terrorists, including the one survivor of the 9/11 attacks. So come to your own conclusions on that one. And then 2 tweets for saying that children should not be subject to gender transition surgeries, social conditioning, or medical transitions. The Conservative Party objected to that, despite the commissioning and implementation of the findings of the Cass review before I had even tweeted that out. So very weird. And then the final tweet was a joke about how maybe some of the new arrivals might not be so integrated into British culture, to the extent of where they may be doing unpleasant things like sleeping in doorways and defecating on doorsteps. And so if the Conservative Party think that that's a positive on the benefits of diversity, I'd scratch my head as to where their immigration policy, the intentions really lie. But anyway, so they said, oh, if you share any of this, and of course, we will take your suspension as permanent. So I tweeted it out, and it wasn't very good optics for them. And as you can bet, I'm not at the conference this year. I'm going on holiday instead.
I mean, I'm surprised, I have to admit, because what did they expect that you would do? Anybody who's familiar with you and the work is, of course, that which is a good thing, right? That you don't shy away from a debate. You don't shy away from controversy. I mean, this is probably the most English or the most British thing that one can do, right? Differences of opinion is almost something that is, in the blood of British political discourse. Would it be fair to characterize you as a conservative without a home? In a sense, is there for people that share your attitudes? And you, I would argue, are still part of the younger generation of the future of Britain in many ways. Do you think that those who share your views are homeless in many ways politically?
So my Twitter bio, before it has any of my various links, says reactionary Catholic Zoomer, I think in that order. And I would describe myself as a social conservative, an attempting Catholic, and of course, a man very much of his generation, a digital native who young men my age, as lots of Europeans, frankly, know with the AfD and National Rally and the Freedom Party in Austria, we just do politics in a different way. It's mimetic. It also changes much faster than the older, more sclerotic, more entrenched and institutional paradigms of the boomers, for example. And so, yes, my worldview is not necessarily represented in any of the mainstream political parties, and there seemed to be a chance that it would be represented in Reform UK with the return of Nigel Farage. Everyone knows Nigel as the man who spearheaded the Brexit campaign, essentially took down the Remainer Theresa May government, and then handed Boris Johnson essentially a mandate in 2019 to get Brexit done by standing down his candidates. Well, he was a very popular GB News host, he was a beloved figure, absolute meme magic, and especially beloved by the younger generations who liked his devil-may-care attitude. So Nigel came back when Rishi Sunak announced a general election with an absolute, just standing in the rain, looking like the wettest possible lettuce. And Nigel said, I'm going to come back and run in the seaside town of Clacton, which is pretty important because Clacton is full of left behind white working class people that moved out of London when new migrants moved in, and so have taken refuge in these sort of forgotten seaside resorts that nobody really visits anymore when they go on holiday to the continent for cheap. Nigel said, I will lead Reform UK and hope to become an MP. As soon as he went back, led the party, they shot up in the polls, Nigel was guaranteed to win, and he did. They got 5 MPs. And then ever since, Reform has professionalised. And what that means is a softening of rhetoric, at least in appearance. The first thing they did was depose Ben Habib, a long-time loyalist, the deputy leader, and replace his position with Richard Tice, who was the former leader of Reform UK until he stepped down for Nigel. He's also an MP. He's been very strong ever since the election, which is encouraging to see, and has taken Richard Tice, his friend, Paul Ogden, out of the role of chairman and replaced him with a man called Zia Youssef. Zia Youssef arrived on the scene about 5 minutes before the election actual day, turned up at Reform's rally, gave a speech about British values, and then gave a large sum of money to the party and was made chairman. I find him utterly unimpressive, and I happen to think, and so do lots of people high up in Reform UK who've spoken to me, happen to think, that he has been selected to act as one-man body armour for a political establishment who will always accuse Reform of being racist and Islamophobic because they notice cultural differences and the fact that Islam has not exactly been without its crimes and its controversies in adapting to Britain. And the other thing that Reform has done is soften its message. So Nigel Farage was interviewed by the excellent Stephen Edgington over on GB News recently. And when Stephen Edgington asked Nigel Farage 2 questions, he gave him very disappointing answers. First of all, he asked Nigel Farage, the white British population has fallen from something like 87% to 74% in the last couple of decades. Is this a concern for you? And Nigel Farage says, no, it's not a concern of mine. All I care about is culture. So Farage doesn't connect the fact that a culture is a story that a people tell themselves, and so you don't get culture without a people, and so if you have a reduction in the people, you have a reduction in the culture. And the other thing he asked was, do you support mass deportations? And Farage says, well, we need to deport criminals currently in prison because there are 10,000 of them. And Edgington said, yeah, sure, but on this issue of mass deportations, Donald Trump is pushing for this, and he's your friend, and he's very popular. There are lots of people on the continent pushing for this. Even Olaf Scholz in Germany is starting to repatriate some Afghan citizens after a series of terror attacks. There are currently 1.2 million or 1.3 million illegal immigrants in the UK, as of Pew Research data, plus since 2018, we've got 130,000 channel crossers. So would you enforce the law and ensure that all of these foreign nationals go back? And Farage says, no, it's a political impossibility. And when pressed on whether or not it was just logistics that got in the way, and Edgington said, is it your ambition at least? He said, no, it's not. So lots of people are turning around and going, well, where is my home then? Because if Reform UK aren't willing to be strong enough on this issue, do I have representation? The last thing I will say is that someone seems to have taken notice of this. Now, the Conservative Party are not very trustworthy, because remember, they presided over this change in immigration that led to at least 1.2 million foreign nationals every year coming into Britain. However, there's a Conservative leadership contest going on at the moment, and Robert Jenrick, who, even after I have been thrown out of the Conservative Party, has not unfollowed me on Twitter, and who I have friends working for and advising his campaign, decided today and yesterday to come out with a policy announcement and a video saying not only will he punish countries who do not repatriate their foreign nationals, like India, by barring visas, because it turns out we have 250,000 Indians entering legally every year. We also have illegal Indian migrants, which I can only presume are serious criminals who would not be allowed in otherwise, as well as breaking into the country. But he also said that I will deport every single illegal immigrant in Britain. Now, whether or not that's a logistical issue, whether or not his party's with him, at least the rhetoric is there, and it's far stronger than what Reform is providing. So all we can hope is a right-wing arms race to provide young conservative Zoomers like me someone to vote for.
This is very fascinating. I forgot to mention at the beginning of our conversation, you also were in a very popular podcast in the UK, I would say by now global, like on trigonometry. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because I'm an avid listener to this as well. I think Francis Foster and Constantine Kissing do a wonderful job. So I think it's really one of the best podcasts out there. And recently they had Sir Neil Ferguson on, right? And I'm a great admirer, great historian. He's not just a Sir in the UK, he has dual citizenship. And they had a conversation about, Britain, history, identity. And towards the end, it seemed to me precisely what you just described relating to Farage, that Ferguson showed a similar attitude, right? When he was asked about the matter of migration, he said, well, there's not much we can do, right? We need mass migration for the labor market. And he made a very, in my opinion, weird comment, because he's married, as you of course know, to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I think is probably one of the staunchest defender of Western values that one can imagine. So she might be Somali or African by heritage, but I think culturally she's fully westernized more than many people who are born here. But he also then had this weird sideswipe as his own children, where he said that his biracial children are much more beautiful than his other children, which I think is an odd thing to say. But I leave that aside. But it sounded very much exactly like what Farage, what you just described, is that you have conservatives with whom you probably as well as I do, I share 90% of their positions. That when it comes to the matter of cultural cohesion, of migration, they seem to swivel. You can almost see how they cringe in their seats, how the question alone makes them uncomfortable. And then they try to come with these evasions of, well, there is not much we can do anyways, and this is going to happen no matter what you do, and it's going to be good for the economy. Just a quick point I would like to hear your opinion on as well, because if we look at the data, yes, some migrants contribute to the economy, but some migrants simply don't. So just making the blanket claim that all migration contributes to the economy in a positive way is simply not true. So I'm often surprised that either people who have generally a good sense of how the people feel, like Nigel Farage, or people who are very intelligent, very smart, like Neil Ferguson, seem to take these odd positions on migration and cultural cohesion.
Yeah, so I'll address those in order. As for Neil Ferguson's comments, I did watch that trigonometry episode. I had Ayaan on my show on Wednesday, actually, and I brought this up and I asked her about it. And she herself, having known the kinds of cultures and environments that a large number of these people come from, I mean, for example, this is a stat put out by Robert Jenrick. In the last year, the UK gave out more family reunification visas for Somalians than visas for physicists, engineers, and chemists from every other country combined. Now, what's going to happen there is they're going to recreate the conditions of Somalia in small and ethnic enclaves and basically make micro-failed states in the UK. And we know that this is not an economic necessity because the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, the exact left-wing body that cooed out Liz Truss, by the way, when she made a marginal adjustment to tax rates, decided, and they keep advising immigration to increase. I think they set the mandatory number for immigration to increase from 245,000 to 315,000 every single year, and it's way above that. But anyway, So Liz Truss's tax cut crashed the economy, but the OBR then put out a report saying, well, actually, our economic policy of low-skilled migration has led to importing people that by the time they reach the age of 66, the pension age claim, cost the British taxpayer £150,000 each. Now, bear in mind, 80% of pre-Brexit migration was European. It's now 80% non-European. We know from Danish studies that Middle Eastern, North African, Pakistan, Turkish, lots of sub-Saharan African as well, migrants, are never NAT tax contributors on average across their lifetime. So they've been importing these people in the millions in the last few years, and they've just come out and said, well, it's not an economic necessity because actually a massive net economic drain. So for Niall Ferguson to say this, and for him to also make the birth rates argument when one of the leading causes, I would think, at least the data I've seen, that's driving down birth rates is housing availability and the economy. So people like me can't get houses, can't get well-paying good jobs, at least, my generation, to start the families that we want. I'm trying to buy a house now, and I can tell you it's bloody awful. And it's not like my missus needs any encouragement to have kids, That's driving down the birth rates of the native population. So we wouldn't have this problem if we, one, sufficiently managed the economy, and two, didn't flood us with dependent foreign nationals. But the other reason as well is that, as you said, Ayaan Hirsi Ali has been utterly assimilated to all the countries she's lived in, the Netherlands, the UK, the US. And she is someone that I would call a grateful house guest, right? And in order to have a home, the homeowners must not only remain a majority over the guests, but also they must reserve the right to both provide hospitality to the grateful guests, to evict the guests who decide to rearrange the furniture without their consent. And what we need is to distinguish those two groups. But the problem you have with, I think, some of the boomer conservatives that you've pointed out, is that even distinguishing those two groups now is called racist. We've gotten to the point where not only is milk racist, or the countryside is racist, but even noticing different behaviors between different groups of people, in aggregate, a culture, is itself racist. And this is the reason I think reform are softening. It's because they want to avoid this idea that there are involuntary aspects to national and personal identity. Because any suggestion, for example, that being of a certain ethnicity might incline someone to be more closely identified with a certain culture because you think it's your home culture, or especially if you're a second generation migrant, it's your parents' home culture. And if you don't feel that you necessarily belong in the culture you were born into, but that you aren't ethnically a part of, then you identify even stronger with the home culture. That can create some kind of conflict about self-identity. But if you're a party that's constantly beset by accusations of racism, especially to the Nazis, because they are the great villain of the 20th century, for good reason, I think, alongside Mao and Stalin, which don't get enough of a say, then what you do instead is you immediately pivot to say, whoa, no, all national identity is consensual. There is absolutely not only is there no moral content, because there isn't, but there is no influential factors on national identity other than what you choose. It's just a set of values. It's just a game of cricket, as Richard Tice said at the Reform Conference. They go to that to avoid those accusations of racism. And it's like, okay, I'm sure that you aren't racist. I get it. I'm sure that you are doing your absolute best to disprove these smears and false allegations. The problem is, though, that's also not true. And that creates a false conception of national identity. And if all we think that makes a citizen, all we think that imbues a culture in someone is that they step through the passport gate and inhale the air of Britain and touch its magic soil, then that's going to lead to a very bad immigration policy, which is going to lead to crime, bankruptcy, and cultural decay. And that's what I think we're seeing right now. And no party is willing to address it.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit what the Dutch have been trying to do for a long time. When newcomers arrive in the country, they show them a video where, for example, two men are kissing and where a girl walks in a miniskirt, because the idea is that somebody from Sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East just doesn't know how it is. But if you show them the video, they will say, this is how things are done here, and then they will immediately integrate. As you said, it's the perception that citizenship or a passport is just a piece of paper. It's a legal status. It is not at all tied to history, to tradition, to a specific culture. I think you make excellent points, and I wholeheartedly agree. The surprising part, and I want to push you a little bit on this because I'm really curious about what you think about it. Why is it people that we generally would see as being on your and my side on the aisle on this, and that I think many people had high hopes for? I mean, as you know better than anybody, I think the reason why, correct me if I'm wrong, but Reform UK got almost 14% of the vote was precisely because people thought, okay, they actually have a backbone. They stand for what they say. They will not become squishy like the Tories have become. So they will stand up for British tradition, for Englishness, for Britishness, whatever then you want to call it. And now, as you correctly say, they seem all of a sudden have then this desire to become what we could call derogatorily an establishment party and give up the very things that made them for so many people electable in the first place.
So I know lots of people are going to say I'm being insufficiently tactical and that they are just biding their time until they take power. I would like to remind them that currently they have power. They have a beachhead of 5 MPs. They cannot be removed unless they commit some serious misconduct. And so if the time to strengthen your rhetoric were to come, it's now, especially as various parties with much stronger rhetoric are making more substantial gains across the continent. But yes, Reform gained 4 million MPs on the auspices that they were going to defend what I would say British identity. So the ethnic and cultural subgroups indigenous to the British Isles, the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons, which actually, funnily enough, Robert Jenrick has been talking a lot stronger about recently as well. Not that the Conservative Party are going to back him. And also to deport foreign criminals and bring the overall number of immigration down. And so to the people that say it's just a tactic, they're biding their time, I fear it's not. And the reason I say that is because I think that, like lots of the Conservative politicians, Nigel Farage himself is a Thatcherite. Now, that worked in a time and a place when you had a homogenous population and when the concerns were foreign policy and economics, when you were facing down the evil empire of the Soviet Union and you were battling socialist subversion at home. And I think you can actually see how this plays out pretty well with the Hungarians, because they have had their culture erased under the Iron Curtain. They had their economy destroyed, but they didn't have their demographics changed. And so they were able to rebound and are now very proud, very prosperous, and are the only country that's able to actually reverse this birth rate decline through strong state policy. What we have done instead is we have imbibed the kind of liberal anthropology that undergirded both Marxism and liberalism. So, for example, the heroes of the Reagan-Thatcher era, I'm thinking of Hayek with Road to Serfdom. He made his principal concern that Nazism could be replicated in other countries than Germany. And so, having fled it, of course, he's concerned about that. So he focused on maximum individual autonomy within the market, within culture, to prevent the rise of authoritarianism and to allow exceptional individuals to create a rising tide which raised all ships. His market arguments, absolutely sound. But the anthropology rests on the idea that human nature and cultural differences are purely products of education and material circumstances. Now, that's a great and optimistic view of human nature, which is the antithesis to the hard-bordered Nazi racism, which, of course, Reform are going to be accused of. But it leaves out that part that lots of people do think that involuntary factors, be it sex in the gender debate, or be it ethnicity in the immigration debate, have a sway over what people believe, what behaviors they have, how they want to live their lives. And so, because lots of the, frankly, older generation who supported Thatcher and are still talking about supply-side economic reform and tax cuts have brought that sort of anthropology to bear on modern politics, they don't understand the concerns of necessarily people that are having to live with the demographic realities, being around people that are unilaterally hostile in an ethnic and a cultural way to the native population. And so I like to sum it up with this phrase, which Harrison Pitt, my co-host on Deprogrammed, relayed to me. In homogeneous societies, ideas are above identity. In heterogeneous societies, diverse societies, identity is always more important than ideas, because you can't discuss them outside a shared moral framework if the identities are in clash. And the problem we have is a lot of those older politicians in the Conservative Party and, I would say, Reform are playing in the paradigm of ideas or values, when unfortunately, because of the levels of immigration and demographic change, we're now fighting on the grounds of identity.
This was the first half of my conversation with Connor. Much more to come. We dive deep into the issues on the right, on the left, the future of politics in the United States, and whether there actually is a chance that more radical ideologies return. Please jump over to the Brussels Signal for the full conversation. And as always, thanks to everyone who's watching. I'll see you again next week.